question that we want answered about behavior. We're going to look at step 3, designing the method. How do you answer your question? We need to design an investigation. And as we know, there are 3 investigation designs, 3 different ways that we can find out information to answer our question. So our video today is going to be talking about the features of each design, the strengths of each one, the limitations of each one, and what they're all best used for. What kind of questions are answered by each design. Before we get into that though, let's just define some terms, particularly the term variables. Variables are anything that changes during your investigation. So first we have the independent variable. This is what we're going to say is the cause of any changes that we measure. The dependent variable is the effect. This is what we are measuring in the investigation. But of course, lots of other things are going on, particularly when we're talking about people. So you can have participant variables. These are quirks or personality traits of the people in your investigation. You can have environmental variables, so the things that are going on in the room at the time, even researcher variables. And all of these together are called extraneous variables. They're other things that might cause changes or that might change during the course of our investigation that we're not particularly interested in. Ideally, we can control those. Then, of course, we need to talk about our sample. Our sample are the participants in our investigation, the people we're researching. And the key thing about the sample is it has to be representative of the population. So it needs to be varied. It needs to include as many different kinds of people that represent the population as possible in order for our results to be reliable. All right, so now we've got all of that understood and squared away. Let's get into these 3 investigation designs. I know you know them. Call them out. Let me hear you. The first one is experimental. The second one, that's right, quantitative observational. And the final one, you got it, qualitative. So experimental is when we're controlling and manipulating the situation. Quantitative observational is when we're looking at variables that already exist. And qualitative is when we want more rich, detailed data. So let's talk experiments. Now, the key feature of an experiment is this degree of control. The fact that the researcher controls and manipulates the independent variable. We're the ones who decide what happens there and how that happens. An experiment can be in a lab or a field setting, but it's all about that manipulated situation that we set it up and we randomly assign who gets exposed to the independent variable and to what degree. So the good things about an experiment is that degree of control. The fact that we can then determine cause and effect. We're controlling all those other extraneous variables, so any changes we see can be said to be the result of the independent variable. We've got this control over the situation. So our results should be really clear. Unfortunately, what we find out may not always apply to real-world situations because of this manipulation, and it also might always be possible to conduct an experiment. So what do you do then? You do a quantitative observational design. This is when your independent variable, your source of your question, is pre-existing. So I want to look at people with blue eyes or brown eyes, or I want to look at people who've lived through a really difficult situation. This is when the independent variable is something that we can't manipulate. It is pre-existing. And so we're looking at what is already going on. And then, of course, it's right there in the name. In a quantitative observational design, we want to collect quantitative data. Now, we might still have a control in an experimental group, but that independent variable, it already exists. We don't manipulate it. So the strength of this design is the fact that we've got this real-world application. We're looking at things that are already happening, but we don't have this control. We can't control the other extraneous variables. So any changes that we see in our dependent variable might not necessarily be the cause of our independent variable, and therefore we can't determine cause and effect. We can only find correlations. And finally, a qualitative design. We use this when we want rich, detailed data, when we're gathering information that is not quantitative. We want non-numerical data. So you might do this in a focus group, or the Delphi technique when we survey a bunch of experts, or in interviews, other kind of surveys. Qualitative data can be all kinds of things as long as it's not numerical. So that positive is we get this rich, detailed data that's more than just numbers on a page. the weaknesses or limitations of it, it's usually based on self-reports, so it's not verifiable, and so we can't necessarily prove what people have said, and it's very complex to analyze. So if all three designs have different features and different strengths and weaknesses, how do we decide which one to use? We need to come back to our question. What problem are we trying to solve? What information are we trying to find? And we choose the design that is most suitable to addressing our question.